Picture a swamp the size of a small country. Now picture that swamp crawling with snakes so big they can swallow a full-grown deer whole, antlers and all. That is not a horror movie pitch. That is the actual Florida Everglades. And for the last 2 decades it has been losing a slow, slithering war against an invader nobody asked for. So when wildlife officials stood up one day and announced their next big weapon against the snake apocalypse, people did not nod thoughtfully. They laughed. Because the plan, on paper, sounded like something a cartoon villain would scribble on a napkin. Fight snakes with snakes. Thousands of them. Released on purpose. By the people who are supposed to be protecting the Everglades, not restocking it. Here's the part that should make you sit up a little straighter. That ridiculous-sounding plan is currently working better than almost anything else Florida has tried, and the people who mocked it the loudest have mostly gone quiet. Stick around, because the way this story ends is genuinely one of the strangest, smartest pieces of wildlife management happening anywhere in the United States right now, and almost nobody outside of Florida has heard the real version. Before we get into it, if you like deep dives into stories where nature gets weirder than fiction, go ahead and like this video and subscribe. It genuinely helps more people find videos like this one. Now, let's talk about the swamp that broke the food chain. Burmese pythons are not from Florida. They are not from anywhere near Florida. Their actual home is the river valleys and grasslands of Southeast Asia, and they ended up in South Florida the same way a lot of exotic animal problems start in America, through the pet trade. Decades ago, baby pythons were sold in pet stores as cute, manageable snakes. The catch nobody mentioned on the price tag was that Burmese pythons do not stay small. They keep growing for most of their lives, and a snake that fits in a show box at 6 months old can stretch past 16 feet and weigh more than a grown man within a few years. Owners who were not prepared for a 16-foot roommate did what far too many people have done with unmanageable exotic pets. They let them loose, usually somewhere near the Everglades, figuring the swamp would just absorb the problem. The swamp did not absorb the problem. The swamp became the problem's perfect home. Southwest Florida offered everything a Burmese python could want: warm and humid air all year long, dense vegetation to hide in, water to swim through, and an absolute buffet of prey animals that had never evolved any instinct to fear a giant ambush predator hiding in the brush. Native Florida animals know what an alligator looks like. They know what a bobcat smells like. They had no idea what they were looking at when a python the length of a school bus showed up, and that ignorance has been catastrophic. The numbers are not subtle. Researchers tracking mammal populations in parts of the Everglades found that raccoon and opossum sightings had dropped by more than 90% in areas with heavy python presence, and rabbits and foxes had become almost impossible to find at all. Wading birds, marsh rabbits, bobcats, and even alligator hatchlings have all shown up in the stomach contents of dissected pythons. In one case that made researchers do a double take, a python measuring roughly 11 feet was found in the middle of swallowing a 77-pound day. The snake itself only weighed around 115 pounds, which means it was attempting to digest a meal worth more than half its own body weight, antlers included. Photographs later confirmed pythons capable of consuming prey that outweighed them entirely, something biologists had assumed was close to physically impossible until the Everglades pythons proved otherwise. By the time anyone had a clear picture of how bad things had gotten, the python population had already exploded into the tens of thousands, spread across roughly 8,000 square miles of wetland, marsh, and forest. Some estimates floated the idea that more than 100,000 pythons could already be established in the wild. And here's the cruelest part of the math. A single adult female python can lay somewhere between 30 and 90 eggs in one clutch, with an average closer to 4 to 6. Most of those eggs hatch. Most of those hatchlings survive, because in the Everglades, a baby Burmese python has almost no natural predators waiting for it. Florida was not just dealing with an invasive species. Florida was dealing with an invasive species that had been handed the ecological equivalent of a cheat code. What makes the python invasion especially difficult to manage is that the snake's range refuses to stay put. What began as a localized problem confined mostly to the southern tip of the state has steadily crept north, with confirmed sightings now reaching well past the original containment zone, toward Lake Okeechobee and beyond. Cold weather, once assumed to be a natural barrier that would keep the snakes boxed into the warmest parts of the peninsula, has turned out to be far less of an obstacle than biologists hoped. Pythons have shown an unsettling ability to survive cold snaps that were supposed to kill them off, tucking into burrows and waiting out the chill before resuming their slow march northward. Every mile of new territory means a fresh population of native animals with zero evolutionary experience of giant constrictors suddenly sharing their habitat with one. The first instinct, understandably, was to send people in with the kind of direct approach that makes for great headlines. Florida licensed bounty hunters, paid stipends and prize money, and even ran public hunting competitions with names like the Python Bowl, encouraging ordinary residents to head into the swamp and bring back as many invasive snakes as they could find. State agencies put together official removal teams, with names like the Python Action Team removing invasive constrictors, and contractors were paid by the hour plus bonuses scaled to the length of every snake they captured. Over the years, this approach has produced some genuinely impressive numbers. Hunters working under official programs have removed pythons that, when you add up the weight, comes out to tons upon tons of invasive snake pulled out of the wetlands. And it still was not enough. Not close. Burmese pythons are masters of disappearing. Their skin pattern mimics dappled light filtering through leaves so convincingly that even experienced hunters have stepped within a few feet of a 15-foot python without noticing it. They spend enormous stretches of time motionless, submerged, or tucked into burrows where no human is ever going to stumble across them by accident. For every python a hunter manages to spot and capture, biologists estimate there are dozens more sitting quietly nearby, completely undetected. Throwing more people at the swamp was not solving the underlying problem, because human eyesight was never going to be the tool that cracked this case. The pythons had the home field advantage, and they were using it perfectly. The Python Bowl in particular turned the crisis into something closer to a sporting event, with cash prizes for the longest snake caught and the most snakes removed over a 10-day stretch, drawing hundreds of competitors from across the country eager to wrestle an invasive predator for bragging rights and a payout. It generated headlines, it generated enthusiasm, and it absolutely removed real snakes from the wild. But a python that has already had 2 or 3 breeding seasons to reproduce before a hunter ever lays eyes on it has already done its damage to the ecosystem regardless of whether it eventually ends up zip-tied in the back of a truck. The competitions were good publicity and decent population control at the margins, but they were never going to be the tool that turned the tide on their own. That is roughly the point where conventional wisdom ran out of ideas, and where the plan that got Florida mocked across late-night television and social media actually began to take shape. Because if you cannot outsee a python, and you cannot outhunt a python, somebody eventually asked the only question left on the table. What if you let a python do the finding for you? In 2013, a team of biologists working with the Conservancy of Southwest Florida, led by a wildlife researcher named Ian Bartosek, started experimenting with an idea that sounded almost too simple to work. Instead of treating every captured python as an enemy to be removed immediately, they would take a select number of male pythons, surgically implant a small radio telemetry transmitter inside their body, and release them right back into the wild they came from. The transmitter would not hurt the snake. It would just let researchers track its exact location using a handheld receiver, the same basic technology used to track wolves, bears, and other wide-ranging wildlife. They started calling these released male scout snakes. Here's where the laughter started. To anyone hearing about this secondhand, it sounded absurd. Florida already had a python infestation big enough to make national news, and the supposed solution was to release more pythons into the wild on purpose. Social media reactions practically wrote themselves. Headlines mocked it as the dumbest wildlife plan in American history. Why would anyone deliberately add to a population that was already out of control? It read like exactly the kind of overcomplicated bureaucratic decision that ends up making a crisis worse instead of better. What the jokes missed was the biology underneath the plan. Burmese pythons are solitary for most of the year, but during breeding season, which runs from November through April, male pythons go searching for receptive females using scent trails the females leave behind. A male python in breeding season will travel for miles, cutting through dense brush, swimming across canals, and slipping through culverts, driven by instinct to find a mate. Researchers realized that this instinct, the single most predictable and powerful behavior in the entire python life cycle, could be turned into a tool. A tagged male was not just a snake released back into the swamp. He was a living guided missile aimed directly at the part of the population doing the most damage, the breeding females. The mechanics of the program are almost elegant once you see the full picture. Each scout snake carries a small transmitter that emits a unique radio frequency. During breeding season, the Conservancy's team straps on receivers, grabs antennas, and heads out into the wetlands on foot, by kayak, and occasionally by air, tracking the signal of each tagged male. As the male python travels in search of a mate, the tracking team follows at a distance, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, letting the snake do the navigating through terrain that would take a human search party years to cover on their own. Eventually, the signal leads the team to where the male has found what he was looking for. Sometimes that means a single female. Sometimes it means something researchers call a mating aggregation, or more bluntly, a mating bull, where multiple males have converged on one large female at the same time, all of them tangled together in the brush. When the team locates the group, they move in, capture every snake present, and the female, almost always the largest and most reproductively important animal in the group, is humanely removed from the population before she has the chance to lay a single egg. The males involved are checked, and if one of them happens to already be a tagged scout snake, he is released again to go find another mate. If he is not yet tagged, researchers may implant a transmitter in him on the spot, turning him into a fresh scout for the rest of the season. The implant procedure itself is more delicate than people might expect from a program dealing with an animal most viewers would rather avoid touching at all. A veterinarian sedates the python, makes a small incision, and inserts a transmitter roughly the size of a large pill into the body cavity before carefully closing the wound. Some of the youngest scout snakes have been tagged not long after hatching, allowing researchers to follow individual pythons across years of growth, tracking exactly how far a single animal travels, how its territory shifts with age, and how long it survives in the wild, data that simply did not exist before the program began. Far from being treated as disposable bait, the scout snakes are monitored, recaptured periodically for health checks, and in some cases tracked for years at a stretch, turning what started as a removal tactic into one of the most detailed long-term studies of python behavior ever conducted in the wild. It is a strange kind of betrayal, when you think about it. The very same instinct that makes a male python so reproductively successful in the wild, the same biological hardwiring that helped this species become an unstoppable invasive force in the first place, is the exact thing researchers exploited to start dismantling it. Some of the scout snakes have even been given names by the team over the years, a habit that started informally and stuck around because the snakes kept being so reliably useful. One scout named Histofer became locally famous after leading researchers to 2 separate mating bulls within a single 24-hour period, a day that ended with 11 pythons and roughly 500 pounds of invasive snake removed from one stretch of forest. Another scout named Lincoln led a team directly to a 16-foot, 140-pound female buried deep in territory that would have taken a ground search party weeks to even reach randomly. A scout snake known by the number 118, nicknamed Snarquin, opened an entire breeding season by leading researchers to a 17-foot, 148-pound female within the first weeks of November. This is the part of the story that turns the mockery upside down. Since the Scout Snake program began in 2013, the Conservancy's team has removed more than 20 tons of invasive Burmese pythons from a roughly 200-square-mile area of southwest Florida, a number that sounds almost unbelievable until you remember these are animals that can weigh over 100 pounds each. One recent season alone produced a record haul of more than 8,000 pounds, or 4 full tons, removed in a single breeding season, the largest single-season total the program has ever recorded. But weight removed is not even the most important number here, because pulling a heavy snake out of a swamp does not necessarily stop the population from rebounding. The number that actually matters is eggs. Every female python intercepted before she lays her clutch represents dozens of pythons that will never exist. Across the life of the program, researchers estimate they have prevented well over 20,000 python eggs from ever hatching, and that figure keeps climbing every season. In one particularly successful stretch, a single season alone accounted for more than 4,000 eggs removed before they could hatch, found inside the bodies of captured females who would otherwise have buried them in nests scattered across the Everglades. Think about what that actually means in practical terms. The average clutch size for a female python in this region sits around 4 to 6 eggs, though researchers have documented clutches ranging from a dozen up to well over 100 in a single female. Every breeding age female that gets pulled out of circulation before laying represents an entire generation of pythons that simply never gets the chance to start. It is not a flashy headline number the way a hunting tournament's leaderboard is, but biologically, It is the single most efficient way anyone has found yet to actually shrink this population instead of just trimming its edges. Here's where the story earns the word "stun" in the title, because the program did not just remove a lot of snakes. It started producing a measurable shift in the population itself. Researchers tracking long-term trends have reported something they were not fully expecting when the program began. Scout snakes are increasingly struggling to locate mates at all in some of the areas the program has worked longest. And when they do find a female, she tends to be smaller and younger than the females found in earlier years. To a biologist, that pattern is close to the clearest possible sign that a wild population is actually shrinking under sustained pressure, rather than simply being skimmed off the top while replacing itself just as fast underneath. In an invasive species fight where almost every other method is produced, at best, a holding pattern, that is an enormous deal. The program has also expanded well beyond a handful of dedicated researchers working alone. Federal partners including the United States Geological Survey, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, the South Florida Water Management District, and researchers from the University of Florida have all joined or collaborated with versions of the Scout snake approach, sharing data, expanding the radiotelemetry network, and applying the same logic across wider stretches of territory than the original conservancy team could ever have covered alone. What started as one biologist's unconventional idea inside a relatively small 200-square-mile study area has become a coordinated, multi-agency strategy being studied as a model for how to fight other invasive reptile populations, not just in Florida, but potentially anywhere else on the planet facing a similar runaway predator problem. And nature itself appears to be lending a hand in ways researchers did not initially predict.